The move was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to rebuild after the divorce left me hollowed out like an old tree. The little town in New Hampshire seemed like the perfect backdrop for a quieter life. Picturesque and sleepy, with streets lined with oak trees and the kind of neighbors who smiled politely but didn't pry. The house itself, a cozy two-story with weathered shutters and a creaky front porch, wasn't much, but it was mine for now. I needed it to be mine. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and reassembling a semblance of normalcy. I worked late into the nights, surrounded by the sound of chirping crickets and the occasional groan of the house settling. It wasn't just the house that needed settling, though. I felt like a guest in my own skin, unsure of what I was supposed to feel, think, or even want anymore. That first morning after the move, I found it. A small piece of paper stuck under the corner of a chair in the living room. I almost didn't notice it as I dragged the chair across the room to find the best light for reading. The note was simple: eggs, milk, bread. A shopping list, handwritten in looping, feminine cursive. I smiled at the thought of whoever had lived here before. It felt oddly comforting, like a small connection to the life of a stranger. I set it aside and went back to unpacking. Over the next few days, little scraps of paper turned up in the most unexpected places. A yellowed sticky note taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet read, "Doctor's appointment, Monday, 3 p.m. Another was crumpled at the back of a drawer. "You're stronger than you think." I laughed at that one, imagining some well-meaning friend trying to cheer up the previous tenant. By the end of the week, I had started collecting the notes in a small box on the counter. They felt too personal to throw away, even though they didn't belong to me. But then something shifted. One morning, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth, my eyes caught on a fresh note stuck to the edge of the glass. It wasn't dusty or crinkled like the others. The handwriting was the same, though. "You didn't sleep well last night." My chest tightened as I stared at it. The words felt heavy, invasive. It wasn't a statement someone would write for themselves. It was an observation, an intimate one. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever wrote it had been watching me. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? People don't just leave notes like that. Maybe it had been here all along and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. That night, I lay awake in bed, listening to the house creak and groan around me. I told myself it was just the wind, the old bones of the building settling into the night, but every sound felt deliberate, every shadow too dark. The next morning, there was another note waiting for me on the kitchen counter. "You've been so brave." For the first time, the words didn't feel reassuring. They felt knowing. I stared at the paper for what felt like an eternity before shoving it into the box with the others. My hands shook slightly as I closed the lid. Who would leave these? How were they still turning up? I'd cleaned this house top to bottom. There was no way I'd miss this many. By the end of the day, the box felt heavier than I could explain. And the discovery of the notes had unsettled me, but I told myself it was nothing. A coincidence maybe, or a remnant of the previous tenant's life that I had somehow overlooked. I tried to convince myself that the logical explanation was always the right one. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The second week in the house began uneventfully. I was settling into my new routine, working from home during the day and spending my evenings organizing what few possessions I'd managed to bring with me. Yet, no matter how much I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't an obvious sensation, like eyes burning into the back of my head. It was subtler, like the faint static of a forgotten radio station humming in the background of my mind. Then came the note on my nightstand. I woke up groggy, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains, and reached instinctively for the glass of water I always kept by the bed. That's when I saw it, a folded square of paper, resting neatly where it hadn't been the night before. My heart stopped as I picked it up. "You dreamed about him again." I felt a chill run through me. My ex? It wasn't just the message itself that terrified me. It was the implication that whoever had left it knew me. They knew my private thoughts, the things I kept buried deep and would never admit to anyone. The rational part of my brain kicked into overdrive. Maybe I had written it myself in my sleep. Maybe I had somehow forgotten. Stress does strange things to the mind, I reasoned. But when I examined the handwriting, my theory fell apart. The looping script was identical to all the other notes. It wasn't mine. That day, I couldn't focus on work. My thoughts kept drifting back to the note, to the impossible questions it raised. I combed through the house, searching for any sign of an intruder. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. I even went down to the basement, a dim, musty space I'd avoided since moving in. There was nothing unusual, no footprints in the dust, no misplaced objects. Yet as I stood there in the silence, I felt it again. That static hum, like the house itself was watching me. The unease began to seep into every corner of my life. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of the lights made my skin crawl. And then the notes started coming more frequently. One appeared on the refrigerator. "You forgot to lock the back door." Another was tucked into the pocket of my coat. "You've been so lonely." By now, the notes felt less like coincidences and more like a dialogue. I didn't want to admit it, but they were addressing me, following me. Whoever was leaving them wasn't just an observer. They were intimate in a way that felt suffocating. That night, I decided to test a theory. I wrote my own note, scribbling hastily on a piece of paper. "Who are you?" I left it on the kitchen counter, just beside the small box where I'd been keeping the others. Then I waited. The hours crawled by, and the house seemed to grow darker with each passing minute. I stayed up, pacing the living room, my ears straining for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. Nothing happened. Finally, exhaustion won, and I collapsed onto the couch, falling into a restless sleep. When I woke, the note I'd written was gone. In its place was another. "I've always been here." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the words. Always, the implications churned in my mind. Was it someone in the town? Someone who had access to the house? Or was it something else? I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but at that moment, the world seemed to tilt, and I wasn't sure what was real anymore. I needed answers. The house was old. Maybe there were hidden spaces, places someone could hide. I began a systematic search, going room by room, knocking on walls, pulling open drawers, and emptying closets. My search turned up nothing unusual until I reached the attic. I hadn't ventured up there yet, mostly because the narrow staircase was so rickety it seemed ready to collapse. But now, armed with a flashlight and driven by a gnawing need to know, I climbed the stairs. The attic was filled with the detritus of past lives, dusty boxes, old furniture, and cobwebs that clung to every corner. It smelled of mildew and time. As I stepped deeper into the space, my foot brushed against something small. I looked down and saw another note. "You're getting closer." I froze. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air pressing down on me. Whoever or whatever was behind this was playing a game, and I was caught in the middle of it. I stood there in the dim attic, the words on the notes swimming in front of my eyes. "You're getting closer." Closer to what? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. The attic felt oppressive, as though the weight of the house above me was bearing down. I shoved the note into my pocket and turned the flashlight's beam toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest. Something glinted faintly beneath a sheet draped over an old trunk. Heart pounding, I moved closer and pulled the sheet away, coughing as a cloud of dust rose around me. The trunk was heavy and ornate, its brass hinges tarnished and its edges scuffed with age. It didn't look like it belonged to anyone who had lived here recently. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid, half expecting something to leap out. Instead, I found a stack of journals. They were bound in cracked leather and smelled of mildew, their spines brittle from time. As I flipped through the pages of the first one, my unease deepened. The entries were written in the same looping cursive as the notes. The handwriting was unmistakable. The journals chronicled the life of a woman named Margaret, who had lived in this house for decades. Her entries began innocently enough, detailing her days tending the garden, baking pies, and hosting dinners for friends. But as I read further, the tone shifted. She wrote about feeling watched, about hearing whispers in the night. She described finding notes, much like the ones I'd been receiving, left in places she was certain she hadn't been. One entry in particular sent chills down my spine. "They're here, always watching. They know my thoughts, my dreams. I can't escape them because they are the house, and now, so am I." The final pages were scrawled in a frantic, nearly illegible hand. Margaret wrote about her desperation to leave, her belief that the house wouldn't let her. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. There was no conclusion, no explanation for what had happened to her. I slammed the journal shut and stumbled back, my mind spinning. If Margaret was right, if she hadn't been imagining things, then what did that mean for me? The house felt alive around me, its creaks and groans suddenly menacing. I needed to get out. As I turned to leave the attic, the door slammed shut behind me. I ran to it, pulling and pounding, but it wouldn't budge. The flashlight flickered, its beam dimming, and then, in the silence, I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. Not mine. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly close. I whirled around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on the far corner where the shadows seemed to shift and ripple, as though something was moving just beyond my line of sight. A voice, soft, almost tender, broke the stillness. "You're part of me now." I screamed, dropping the flashlight as darkness enveloped me. My knees buckled, and I hit the floor, clutching my head as a wave of dizziness washed over me. Images flashed behind my eyes. Margaret's life, her memories, her fears. They weren't just stories in a journal. They were being poured into me, merging with my own thoughts. I don't know how long I lay there, caught in the grip of whatever force held me. When I finally came to, the attic door was open, and the flashlight was dead beside me. My body ached, and my mind felt raw, as though something had been torn out and replaced. I didn't wait to pack. I stumbled down the stairs, grabbed my keys, and left the house. I drove until the town disappeared behind me, the house's shadow lingering in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I reached a motel miles away, where I collapsed onto the bed, my head still spinning. For days, I tried to convince myself it was over. The house couldn't follow me. But as I unpacked my bag in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, I found another note. "You can't leave. You're part of us now." I stared at it, tears streaming down my face. Margaret hadn't been crazy. The house wasn't just alive. It was hungry. And now it had me. There was no escaping it. The house wasn't a place. It was a presence, one that had claimed me as its own. I could leave the building, but I couldn't leave it. I haven't gone back. I've been living in motels, changing locations every few days, trying to outrun something that I know is already inside me. The notes still come, slipping under doors, appearing on mirrors, waiting for me wherever I go. I don't know how this ends. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe I'll become like Margaret, my life consumed and rewritten by a force I can't understand. Maybe one day someone else will move into the house and I'll be the one leaving notes for them, whispering through the walls, waiting for them to realize the truth. Maybe I already am. The house wasn't much to look at, but it was enough for me. A simple rental in a quiet Illinois neighborhood tucked between two massive oak trees that framed the narrow driveway. It wasn't just the house that felt small. The whole town seemed to operate in miniature. One gas station, one diner, and a grocery store that closed promptly at 8 p.m. After the chaos of the city and the fallout of my divorce, I craved this simplicity. I wanted quiet, routine, and the kind of life where nothing extraordinary happened. The first week went as I'd expected. I spent my days unpacking the essentials, mostly books, clothes, and the battered old coffee maker I couldn't live without. My evenings were spent on the couch with whatever movie the local cable channel decided to play. The nights, though, were when the house really spoke. The creaks of old wood and the occasional groan of the pipes became a lullaby, lulling me into restless sleep. But by the end of that week, I noticed something. It started as a flicker of movement outside my living room window, visible only from the corner of my eye. When I finally looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was a bird or the sway of the branches in the wind, but the next night, the flicker turned into a figure. At first, I thought it was a prank. Kids messing around, maybe. A man stood in the backyard of the house across from mine, silhouetted by the dim light of their porch. He wasn't facing me, but I could tell he was tall and wearing a bright red coat that seemed to glow in the moonlight. He was completely still. I watched him for a moment, waiting for him to move, to do anything. When he didn't, I convinced myself it wasn't my business and pulled the curtains shut. The following night, he was there again. Same spot, same red coat, same eerie stillness. I leaned closer to the window, studying him, trying to figure out what he was doing. Was he gardening in the middle of the night, waiting for someone? But again, he didn't move, not even a twitch. After a few minutes, I gave up and turned off the lights, unsettled but unwilling to get involved. The pattern continued for days. Every night, at exactly midnight, he was there. And every night, I watched for a little longer, hoping for some explanation. But he never did anything except stand there, perfectly still, always facing away. I started mentioning it to myself out loud, half jokingly, as if saying it made it less strange. "There's the guy in the red coat again," I'd mutter, forcing a laugh that felt hollow even to me. By the end of the second week, he started moving. Not walking, exactly. More like each night he'd shifted slightly closer to my house. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The distance between his spot and my window was too far for anyone to cross without me noticing. But each night, there he was, undeniably closer. One night, he stood at the edge of his yard, right by the fence separating our properties. The sight made my stomach drop. I told myself I'd call the police if he crossed over. That's where I drew the line. But then I realized something that made my skin crawl. He wasn't facing me. He never was. Even as he got closer, he remained turned away, his back a vivid red blur against the night. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it didn't matter. He wasn't doing anything illegal, just standing there, being strange. But deep down, I knew it wasn't normal, and it wasn't harmless. The next morning, I found something that froze me in my tracks. Red footprints. Bright, wet, and unmistakable, leading from the fence line up to my window. They weren't there when I went to bed, and they weren't human exactly. The shape was odd, distorted, as if someone had dragged something heavy with each step. But the worst part was that they didn't stop at the window. They went inside. When I checked, the back door was locked. All the windows were shut. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. Yet the footprints were there, smeared faintly across the living room floor before vanishing into thin air. That night, I didn't just wait. I stayed up, sitting in the dark, watching for him. Midnight came, and I braced myself. Midnight came, and so did he. I sat in the darkened living room, my hands clutching the edge of the windowsill as I watched. The man in red appeared as if out of thin air, standing just beyond the fence line. The moonlight caught the vibrant hue of his coat, which seemed too bright, too alive for the muted tones of the night. He was closer now, no question about it. The distance between him and my house had dwindled to a few yards, and as always, he stood perfectly still, his back to me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep watching. I needed to know what he was doing, why he was getting closer. I waited for movement, for some sign that he was human and not just some thing. But there was nothing. He was like a statue, immovable and unyielding. Then I blinked, and he was gone. I jerked back from the window, my breath hitching. 1 second he was there, and the next, the yard was empty. I stared at the spot where he'd stood, willing him to reappear, but the yard remained still. The air outside felt heavier somehow, as if the night had absorbed his presence. I stayed by the window for an hour, maybe longer, until exhaustion overtook my fear, and I finally fell asleep on the couch. When I woke the next morning, it wasn't the sunlight streaming through the window that pulled me from sleep. It was the smell. A metallic tang filled the air, sharp and nauseating. My head throbbed as I sat up, and that's when I saw them. The red footprints were back, brighter this time, vivid against the pale wood of the living room floor. They started at the back door, which was still locked, and trailed across the room before stopping abruptly in the center. There was no mud, no water, just a deep, wet crimson that looked like blood, but wasn't sticky to the touch. I grabbed a rag and tried to clean them, but the marks wouldn't fade. It was as if the color had seeped into the wood itself, staining it permanently. My hands shook as I worked, and eventually I gave up, retreating to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. That was when I noticed something else, my reflection in the mirror. My face looked pale, gaunt even, and my eyes had a hollow, sunken quality to them. But it wasn't just that. On the corner of my forehead, barely visible beneath my hairline, was a faint smudge of red. I scrubbed at it frantically until it disappeared, but the unease lingered. The day passed in a haze. I tried to focus on work, but every sound made me jump. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see the man in red standing in the yard during the day. But he didn't come. Whatever this was, it belonged to the night. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I tried to prepare myself. I locked every door and window, triple-checked them, and even dragged a chair against the back door for good measure. I told myself it was just a precaution, even though I knew, deep down, that locks wouldn't keep him out. Midnight arrived with an almost ceremonial stillness. The house seemed to hold its breath as the clock struck 12. I forced myself to look out the window, expecting to see him in the same spot as before, but he wasn't there. I scanned the yard, my pulse quickening. The silence felt wrong, oppressive. I was just about to turn away when I saw him, closer than ever, standing in the shadows at the very edge of my patio. His back was still to me, but this time the angle of his head was slightly tilted, as if he was listening for something. My breath caught in my throat. He was too close. "Who are you?" I whispered, the words barely audible even to myself. He didn't respond. He didn't move, and yet I felt an overwhelming certainty that he had heard me. The next morning, the red footprints were gone, but something worse had taken their place. On the patio, written in the same crimson substance, was a single word: "Welcome." The word burned itself into my mind as I stood there, staring at it. It wasn't just a message. It was an invitation, or maybe a warning. Either way, it made one thing clear. I wasn't dealing with something random. This was deliberate. That night, I decided I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. I had to find out what was happening, who this man was, and why he was targeting me. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The backyard was quiet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. I followed the footprints, or at least where they had been, toward the fence. Beyond it, the neighbor's yard stretched into darkness. I climbed over the fence, landing softly on the other side. The house was silent, its windows dark. It didn't look abandoned, but there was no sign of life either. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. That's when I saw it. The door to the basement, slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but then I thought of the footprints, the messages, and the figure in red. If I didn't go down there, I'd never get answers. So, I took a deep breath, gripped the flashlight tighter, and stepped inside. The basement door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the oppressive silence like a scream. A damp, earthy smell wafted up from the darkness below, and the beam of my flashlight revealed a narrow staircase leading down. Each step groaned under my weight as I descended, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was ready for anything, but the truth was I wasn't sure what I would find, or if I would even make it back out. At the bottom of the stairs, the air was thick and heavy, and the space opened into a large, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves holding ancient, dust-covered books, jars filled with unidentifiable substances, and strange carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The floor was made of packed dirt, and in the center of the room was a circle drawn in the same crimson substance as the footprints. Symbols I didn't recognize surrounded the circle, their jagged edges glinting faintly in the light. And there he was. The man in red stood at the far edge of the circle, his back still to me. The sight of him up close was more terrifying than I had imagined. His coat seemed to shimmer, as if it were alive, and his presence radiated an unnatural stillness. I wanted to call out to him, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but somehow I felt his attention shift to me, like a pressure building in the room. I forced myself to step closer, my feet crunching on the dirt floor. As I approached, I noticed something chilling. The circle wasn't drawn in paint or ink. It was blood, dark and congealed, and it reeked of iron. My stomach turned, but I kept going. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak, my voice trembling. "Why are you doing this?" For the first time, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head just enough for me to catch the edge of his profile. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes burned with a light that wasn't human. His lips didn't move, but his voice filled the room, deep and resonant, as if coming from everywhere at once. "I am a messenger," he said, "and you have been chosen." "Chosen for what?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "I didn't ask for this. I don't even know what this is." He turned fully now, and I stumbled back. His face was wrong, too perfect, too smooth, as if it were a mask stretched over something else. His eyes, glowing faintly red, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "You entered the circle," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "There is no turning back." I looked down and realized, with a sickening jolt, that my feet had crossed the line of the blood circle without me noticing. The symbols around it began to glow faintly, and the air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest like a weight. "You are part of the pact now," he continued. "The society waits in the shadows, as it always has. We exist beyond the reach of light, feeding on those who dare to tread too close." I shook my head, backing away. "I didn't choose this. I don't want any part of it." But he only smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that made my skin crawl. "It doesn't matter what you want. The moment you stepped inside, you became ours." The symbols on the ground began to pulse, and a low hum filled the room. The jars on the shelves rattled, and the carvings on the walls seemed to writhe and shift, as though alive. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the chaos. The air seemed to thicken with every step, clawing at me, slowing me down, but I pushed through it, driven by sheer panic. I burst out of the basement and into the yard, gasping for air. The night was eerily silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I didn't stop running until I reached my own house, slamming the door shut behind me and collapsing onto the floor. My chest heaved as I tried to process what I had seen, what I had heard, but the quiet didn't last long. A soft tapping at the window made me freeze. Slowly, I turned my head and my stomach dropped. There, standing just outside, was the man in red. His face was pressed against the glass, his glowing eyes fixed on me. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the back door, only to find it already open. My house, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The walls seemed to close in, and I knew there was no escape. The words he had spoken echoed in my mind. "You are part of the pact now." The next morning, the footprints were everywhere. On the floors, the walls, even the ceiling. They formed patterns, symbols I couldn't understand but knew I was tied to. And in the center of the living room, a new message waited, written in crimson. "You can't run. You are one of us now." I realized then that the society wasn't just an ancient group lurking in the shadows. It was something more. A force, a presence that had claimed me as its own. And no matter where I went, it would follow. Now, every night at midnight, I hear the footsteps. They start outside, circling the house, growing closer. And every time I close my eyes, I see the man in red, waiting for me to take my place. I found the camera on a whim. It was a Saturday morning, and the air had the crisp chill of early autumn, the kind of day that begged for hot coffee and lazy walks through the neighborhood. A garage sale on the corner of 9th and Maple caught my eye, a jumble of mismatched furniture, boxes of old books, and trinkets that had seen better days. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but then I saw it. Sitting on a fold-out table between a chipped vase and a stack of vinyl records was an old camera. It wasn't like anything I'd used before. Bulky, metallic, with a worn leather strap and the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of another era. A relic from the 1950s, I guessed. "How much?" I asked the man running the sale. He was elderly, with a slight stoop and hands that trembled as he adjusted his glasses. He glanced at the camera, almost as if he'd forgotten it was there. $15, he said after a pause, though his voice carried a note of reluctance. I didn't haggle. The price seemed fair, and besides, there was something about the camera that drew me to it. As I handed over the cash, the man hesitated. "It's got character," he said cryptically before turning his attention to another customer. By the time I got home, the camera felt like a treasure. My apartment, a modest one-bedroom in the quieter outskirts of Portland, was where I spent most of my free time tinkering with photography. The light through my large windows was perfect for experimenting with angles and shadows. I cleaned the camera carefully, admiring the way the brass edges gleamed despite their age. I loaded it with film I had lying around from another project and began snapping pictures around the apartment. The camera's heavy click was satisfying, and the images it produced, once developed, had a warmth and texture I hadn't seen in years. A softness that digital photography just couldn't replicate. It wasn't until a few days later, when I was flipping through the prints, that I noticed something odd. In one of the shots of my living room, there was a shadow in the corner. It was faint but distinct, shaped vaguely like a person. At first, I chalked it up to a trick of the light. My apartment had plenty of odd angles where shadows could play tricks. But then I noticed another one. In a picture of my kitchen, there was a darker patch near the window, almost like someone had been standing there. The realization unsettled me. I lived alone, and no one had been in my apartment when I took the photos. Still, I told myself it was nothing, just the quirks of an old camera, and brushed it off. Over the next few days, I found myself using the camera more often. There was something addictive about it, the way it forced me to slow down, to frame each shot carefully. I took photos of my bookshelves, my desk, even the small collection of plants on the windowsill. But as I developed more pictures, the shadows kept appearing. They weren't always in the same spot, and sometimes they were barely noticeable. Other times, though, they were unmistakable. In one photo taken in the hallway leading to my bedroom, the shadow was larger, closer, almost as if it were stepping forward. It was a coincidence, I told myself, an imperfection in the film, maybe even a fault in the lens. But late at night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. My apartment, once a haven, felt different, heavier. I started hearing faint creaks and groans in the floorboards, though I tried to blame them on the building settling. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to use the camera to take a few shots of my bedroom, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I set up the camera on a tripod at the foot of the bed, adjusted the timer, and let it click away while I tried to fall asleep. The next morning, I developed the film. My hands trembled as I flipped through the photos. At first, they seemed ordinary, just me lying in bed, illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But then, in the last photo, my breath caught in my throat. A figure was standing next to my bed. It wasn't distinct, just a shadowy silhouette with no discernible features. But its presence was undeniable. My heart raced as I stared at the image. It was right there, leaning over me, and I had no idea. The photo haunted me. All day, the image of that shadowy figure leaning over me stayed in my mind, refusing to fade. I carried it with me, a persistent unease that turned every sound into something sinister. The apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap. I spent the morning trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a double exposure, I told myself, or a trick of the light. But the longer I stared at the print, the harder it was to believe that. The figure was too clear, its posture too deliberate. It wasn't an accident. Whatever it was, it had been in my room. By afternoon, I couldn't stand to have the camera in the apartment anymore. I put it back in its case, shoved it into a plastic bag, and headed out. The cool Portland air was a relief, helping to clear my head. I walked aimlessly until I found myself at a nearby park with a small pond. Without hesitating, I tossed the bag into the water, then watching as it sank below the surface. The weight in my chest lifted slightly, and I headed home, convincing myself that I'd done enough. It was just an old camera, after all. Whatever strange energy it carried, it was gone now. Or so I thought. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak of the apartment felt louder, more deliberate. Around 3 a.m., I woke with a start, my heart pounding. I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I turned on the bedside lamp and scanned the room. Nothing, just shadows, furniture, and the faint hum of the city outside. I got up to get a glass of water, and that's when I saw it. Sitting on the table in the living room was the camera, completely dry and pristine. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. I had watched it sink into the pond, but there it was, as if it had never left. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, unable to bring myself to touch it. Finally, I grabbed a blanket from the couch and slept in the living room with all the lights on. I couldn't face my bedroom, not after what I'd seen in the photo. The next morning, I tried to throw it away again. This time, I took it to a dumpster several blocks away. I watched as the garbage truck came by and crushed the contents, including the camera. I even stayed until the truck left, just to be sure. That night, I went to bed feeling a little lighter. But the following morning, The camera was back, sitting on the windowsill, gleaming in the sunlight as if taunting me. I felt a wave of nausea. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't logical. It was something else, something I didn't understand and didn't want to. I tried to ignore it. I shoved the camera into the closet and closed the door, telling myself that if I didn't look at it, it couldn't hurt me. But that didn't stop the sounds. At night, I began hearing faint clicks, like the sound of a shutter snapping. They came from the closet, soft at first, but growing louder. And it wasn't just the noise. Objects in the apartment started shifting. A chair would be out of place, or a book would be on the floor even though I hadn't touched it. Desperation drove me to search for answers. I went back to the neighborhood where I'd bought the camera, hoping to find the old man who had sold it to me. But when I arrived, the house was empty. A neighbor told me he had moved out weeks ago and didn't leave a forwarding address. She didn't know much about him, only that he had been quiet and kept to himself. I started researching the camera itself, trying to find anything that could explain its strange behavior. Online forums about vintage cameras yielded little until I stumbled upon a post in a paranormal discussion board. Someone had written about a similar camera, one that seemed to document what shouldn't be seen. The post was vague, but it mentioned a photographer in the 1950s who had disappeared while working on a project involving haunted locations. The last known record of her was a photograph she had taken, which supposedly showed her surrounded by shadowy figures. I felt the weight of those words settle over me. The camera wasn't just old, it was cursed. It didn't just take pictures, it revealed something, and now it was tied to me. The final straw came when I developed another roll of film. I hadn't taken any new photos, but the film was full of images. Every shot was of my apartment, taken from angles I didn't recognize. The shadows were clearer now, more defined. In one, the figure stood in the corner of my kitchen, its head tilted as if watching. In another, it was in the hallway closer than ever. The last photo stopped my heart. It was me, lying in bed, with the shadow standing directly over me, its hand outstretched. I knew then that this wasn't something I could escape. I sat on the floor, the last photo still clutched in my trembling hands. The figure's outstretched hand, the overwhelming sense of malice, and the fact that it had been standing over me, watching, waiting, were too much to process. My apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in, and the once familiar space was now alien. Hostile. I couldn't stay here anymore. Not with it. I grabbed the camera and shoved it into a duffel bag. There was no point trying to throw it away again. It always came back. No, I needed to destroy it. Completely. Permanently. Driving to the outskirts of the city, I found a scrapyard. The air was thick with the acrid smell of oil and rust, and the low rumble of machinery filled the space. I approached one of the workers, a gruff man with grease-streaked overalls, and asked if I could pay to have something destroyed in the hydraulic press. He eyed me suspiciously, but agreed after I handed him a wad of cash. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his tone wary. "Just an old camera," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't ask any more questions. I followed him to the press, a hulking machine with massive steel plates that could crush anything into scrap. I placed the camera on the platform, its gleaming surface looking eerily untouched despite everything it had been through. "You sure about this?" the worker asked, his hand hovering over the controls. "Do it," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. With a deafening crunch, the press came down, flattening the camera into a twisted mass of metal and glass. Relief washed over me. It was done. The nightmare was over, or so I thought. That night, I returned to my apartment, exhausted but hopeful. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I even managed to sleep, falling into a deep, dreamless slumber. But in the morning, I woke to the sound of a soft click. My heart sank as I turned my head. There on the nightstand was the camera, pristine, as if nothing had happened to it. My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea hit me. I couldn't even scream. I sat there, staring at it, paralyzed. Then I heard something else. The faint sound of footsteps. Not outside, not in the hall, but inside the apartment. They were slow, deliberate, moving closer to the bedroom. My eyes darted to the door, which was ajar. Shadows flickered on the wall outside, unnaturally long and fluid, as if they belonged to something that wasn't entirely human. I grabbed the camera, desperate to understand, to fight back, to do something. My hands trembled as I raised it to my face and looked through the viewfinder. The lens showed the room in sharp detail, but there was more. Standing in the doorway was the shadowy figure. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was dense, almost solid, its edges writhing like smoke. It stepped into the room, moving toward me. Click. I snapped the photo, and for a moment, the figure froze. Then, as the camera's shutter reset, it tilted its head toward me. A cold wave washed over me, and I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, as if it was reaching into me, claiming something. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, the camera resting beside me. But everything was different. The air felt heavier, and the light streaming through the windows seemed dimmer, as if filtered through a haze. My apartment was silent, too silent, and I realized with growing dread that the sense of being watched hadn't gone away. It had deepened. I tried to leave, but every time I stepped out the door, I found myself back inside. No matter how far I walked, no matter which direction I turned, I always ended up in the same room, with the camera waiting for me. I stopped trying after the first day, or was it a week? Time didn't seem to work the same way anymore. The shadows in the apartment grew darker, thicker, and they moved freely now. Sometimes they brushed past me, cold and heavy, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Other times they stood in the corners, watching, always watching. I've given up trying to destroy the camera. It's part of me now, or maybe I'm part of it. I take photos because I don't know what else to do. Every image shows the same thing. Me, trapped, surrounded by shadows that draw closer with each frame. They've begun to take shape, their forms more distinct, their features almost human. I don't know how this ends or if it ever will. The camera is still here, still taking photos, and now I'm starting to wonder, is it documenting my life or creating it? I had never imagined myself living in a house like this, a century-old relic with its creaky floors, intricate crown molding, and a front porch that seemed to stretch endlessly. It wasn't the kind of place I would have chosen before, but life has a way of pushing you into unexpected corners. After my divorce, I needed space, both literal and emotional, and this house, with its tall windows and wide rooms, promised exactly that. The move itself had been exhausting, but there was something oddly comforting about unpacking my life into a new space. I spent days organizing the essentials, hanging curtains and placing my favorite belongings in the perfect spots. My mother's gold ring, a brooch she'd worn on her wedding day, sat in a small velvet box on my nightstand. On the wall in the living room, I hung a framed black and white photo of my grandparents, their stern but loving expressions a reminder of a steadier time. These items weren't just things, they were pieces of me. For the first few weeks, the house was everything I needed. Quiet, calm, a retreat from the noise of the world. My days were filled with small projects, painting the bedroom walls a soft lavender, rearranging furniture, and planting tulips in the overgrown garden. At night, I would curl up on the couch with a book, letting the old house's creaks and groans become a soothing background. But then, the first object disappeared. It was the ring. I had taken it out of the box the night before, planning to wear it to a work meeting, but in the rush of the morning, I'd forgotten. When I returned later that day, it was gone. I tore the bedroom apart, pulling out drawers and lifting the mattress. Nothing. I told myself I must have misplaced it, but a small knot of anxiety began to form in my chest. 2 days later, the ring reappeared. In the garden, half buried in the soil near the tulips I had planted. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what to make of it. I hadn't been gardening since the day I moved in, and even then, I hadn't worn the ring. My first thought was that I'd been careless, dropping it outside without realizing. But the knot in my chest tightened. Something about the way it sat there, as though placed intentionally, felt wrong. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing, and tried to move on. But then it happened again. A few days later, my grandmother's brooch was missing. I'd kept it in the drawer of my desk, where it had always been. And just like the ring, it turned up somewhere strange, on the windowsill of the attic, a place I hadn't even set foot in. By now, I couldn't ignore the pattern. These weren't random losses. Each item was connected to something deeply personal, something emotional. The ring reminded me of my mother's passing, the brooch of my grandparents' enduring love. And while I tried to brush off the unease, the house seemed to pulse with it, as if it were feeding on my memories. The breaking point came one evening as I sat at the dining table, sorting through a box of keepsakes. I was looking for a photo of my ex-husband, a small comfort despite our painful split. But the photo was missing, replaced by an old, crumpled postcard I didn't recognize. On it was a faded image of the house, its porch slightly less weathered light with the words, "Home is where the heart breaks," scrawled on the back. I didn't sleep that night. The unease that had begun as a faint whisper was now a constant presence. My house, my refuge, no longer felt like my own. Every room seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds I couldn't place, soft footsteps, faint whispers that seemed to echo from nowhere. I tried to tell myself it was the creaking of an old house, but my gut told me otherwise. The incidents continued, escalating in both frequency and strangeness. One morning, I noticed that the old wooden jewelry box on my dresser was gone. It wasn't just misplaced, it had completely vanished. Frustrated and unnerved, I searched the entire house, room by room, until I found it sitting neatly at the foot of the staircase leading to the attic. I hadn't been up there since I moved in, but something about the placement felt deliberate, as if it were waiting for me to notice it. That evening, I finally worked up the courage to climb the stairs. The attic door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dim, dusty space cluttered with forgotten furniture and cardboard boxes that sagged under the weight of time. The air was colder up there, almost damp, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic. I found my jewelry box on an old trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were my belongings, but they were arranged differently, as if someone had been sifting through them. At the very bottom was something I didn't recognize, a yellowed photograph of a man standing on the front porch of the house. His face was blurry, but there was something haunting about the way he stood, stiff, almost unnatural. Written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Nothing lasts forever." I brought the photo downstairs, unable to shake the chill it gave me. That night, I searched online for any information I could find about the house. It didn't take long to discover its troubled history. A man named Harold Bennett had lived here for nearly 40 years. He was described as reclusive, eccentric, and obsessively attached to his belongings. The records hinted at financial ruin and a gradual descent into isolation. He'd lost the house in a foreclosure and reportedly died alone in a shelter downtown. The house had changed hands several times since then, but no one had stayed long. The more I read, the more the pieces began to click. The missing objects, the way they reappeared in strange places, it wasn't random. Harold's presence was still here, tied to the things he'd lost, and somehow he was using me, my memories, my pain, to anchor himself. That night, as I sat in the living room, the air seemed to shift. The lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow pass through the hallway. My chest tightened, and I clenched the photograph in my hand. "Harold," I whispered, testing the name aloud. The house seemed to groan in response. I decided to test a theory. I took a small keepsake, a bracelet my best friend had given me in college, and placed it on the coffee table. I left the room for only a few minutes, just long enough to boil water for tea. When I returned, the bracelet was gone. I searched the house, my heart pounding. Finally, I found it on the windowsill in the bedroom, perfectly aligned with the glass. It overlooked the garden where I'd first found my mother's ring. The realization hit me like a punch. Harold wasn't just taking objects. He was leading me, guiding me through my own memories, forcing me to confront them in ways I didn't understand. I was no longer just living in this house. I was sharing it with something old, something broken, and something that wouldn't let go. The house felt alive now, its presence growing stronger with each passing day. Every object I cherished seemed to disappear, only to reappear somewhere else, tied to a memory I hadn't revisited in years. It wasn't just the disorientation anymore, it was the deliberate nature of it. Harold wanted me to see something, to feel something, but I didn't know what. The final incident began with the locket. It had belonged to my mother, a small gold heart with a photo of me as a child inside. I wore it often, especially after she passed. When I noticed it missing, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I searched the entire house, tearing through drawers, cabinets, and even under the bed, but it was nowhere to be found. That night, I heard the whispers again. They were louder now, urgent, filling the air with a sense of pleading. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time, it was coming from the attic. I hadn't gone back up there since finding the jewelry box, but something compelled me now. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs, my hands trembling. The attic was colder than before, the air thick and heavy. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, landing on something at the far end of the room. My locket. It hung from a nail driven into the wall, glinting faintly in the light. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, blending into something almost like a voice. It wasn't angry, it was desperate. I reached for the locket, but as my fingers closed around it, a wave of emotion hit me. It was like every painful memory I'd ever had flooded back at once. Losing my mother, the divorce, the feeling of being completely alone. It was overwhelming, suffocating. And then I saw him. Harold. He wasn't solid, but he wasn't entirely a shadow either. His figure shimmered in the faint light, his face indistinct but unmistakably human. He stood near the wall, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't speak, but I could feel what he wanted, to show me something, to make me understand. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice breaking. The air around him shifted, heavy with sorrow. Images began to flood my mind. Harold, young and full of hope, standing in this house with a family that smiled around him. Then loss, his wife leaving. His child taken from him, the foreclosure, the gradual erosion of everything he'd loved until he was left with nothing but the house, empty and hollow, a tomb for his grief. "I can't bring them back," I whispered, unsure if he could hear me. "I can't fix what happened to you." The figure didn't move, but the air grew colder, almost angry. The locket in my hand burned like ice, and I realized he wasn't just trapped here. He was clinging to the pain, to the memories. And now, he was trying to make me do the same. "No," I said firmly, gripping the locket tighter. "You don't control me." I turned and ran down the stairs, clutching the locket like a lifeline. I didn't stop until I reached the living room, where I placed every object Harold had taken and returned. The ring, the brooch, the photograph, into the box I'd found in the attic. I closed the lid, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Harold," I said aloud, my voice steady. "You need to let go. You can't stay here anymore." The room seemed to hold its breath. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. For a moment, the house was completely silent. And then the whispers stopped. The next morning, the air in the house felt different, lighter. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel watched. The box in the living room sat untouched, its lid closed as if sealing something inside. I knew I couldn't stay here, not after everything. But I also knew Harold was finally at peace. At least I hoped he was. As I packed my things to leave, I noticed one last item on the kitchen counter: my mother's locket. It hadn't been there when I placed the other objects in the box. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it was a sign, but then I smiled. It was mine again, and I wasn't afraid to take it with me. As I locked the door for the final time, I felt the house watching, but it wasn't with malice. It was with gratitude, as if Harold was saying goodbye. I stepped into the sunlight, ready to leave the past and the house behind. The smell woke me up. At first, I thought it was a dream, a vivid memory of Sunday dinners from my childhood, roasted meat, herbs, and freshly baked bread. But as I sat up in bed, the aroma lingered, warm and inviting, drifting through the darkness of my apartment. I glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. My stomach growled despite the hour, and I felt a strange pull to get up, to investigate. But then I remembered. I lived alone, and I hadn't cooked in weeks. My dinners usually came in cardboard boxes delivered to my door, or pre-packaged meals I barely remembered heating in the microwave. My kitchen was spotless, unused, and yet the smell was unmistakable. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and padded into the hallway. The air was thick with the scent now, almost overpowering, as though a feast had been prepared just steps away. The faint glow of the street lamp outside illuminated the kitchen, and I hesitated before stepping in. The room was empty. The counters were clean, the stove untouched. The refrigerator hummed softly in the corner, its light blinking on as I opened it. nothing out of place. I let out a nervous laugh, shook my head, and went back to bed, telling myself it was probably a neighbor cooking late at night, the smell somehow seeping through the old walls. But the next night, it happened again. The same smell, roasted meat, garlic, and something faintly sweet. This time, it came with a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the sound of distant voices just out of reach. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. My stomach twisted with unease, but curiosity pushed me out of bed and into the kitchen. Again, there was nothing. The stove was cold, the counters untouched, but the smell was stronger this time, almost taunting. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the room, waiting for something to move, for some explanation to present itself. When nothing happened, I turned and went back to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. By the third night, I was beginning to feel unmoored. The smell was more complex now, spices I couldn't name, a hint of citrus, and the unmistakable richness of slow-cooked meat. It didn't feel like something coming from a neighbor's apartment. It felt closer, more intimate, as if it were being prepared just for me. This time, I stayed awake, determined to catch whatever it was in the act. I sat in the living room with a cup of coffee, the hours crawling by in silence. When the smell finally hit, it was like a wave, filling the air with a warmth that was both comforting and suffocating. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, and walked toward the kitchen. The room was empty, as always, but on the counter, I saw something that hadn't been there before. A single knife, polished to a mirror shine, resting on a folded cloth. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't own a knife like that. I picked it up hesitantly, the metal cool against my skin. The handle was engraved with intricate designs, too ornate to be modern. It felt out of place, almost ceremonial. My reflection in the blade was distorted, and for a moment I thought I saw something behind me, just a flicker, a shadow. But when I turned, the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, the knife in front of me, and stared at it until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. The smell had faded, but the sense of unease lingered, crawling under my skin like a cold wind. By morning, I was convinced it was my mind playing tricks on me. Stress, loneliness, maybe even some bizarre sleepwalking episode. I shoved the knife into a drawer and went about my day, trying to forget the night entirely. But that evening, as I walked into the apartment after work, the smell was there again, thicker, richer than before. And on the dining table where I had left nothing sat a plate, empty, but carefully with silverware on either side, waiting for a meal that wasn't mine. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the plate on my dining table. The silverware was polished to a high shine, the napkin folded into a neat triangle. It was unsettling in its precision, a quiet message that I couldn't ignore. My first thought was that someone had been in my apartment. But how? The door had been locked, the windows latched. The plate, like the knife from the night before, wasn't mine. The air was thick with the scent again. Herbs, roasted meat, and something faintly metallic underneath. It clung to the walls, the furniture, and my skin. I checked every corner of the apartment, every drawer, every closet. Nothing was out of place except for that one detail. I didn't eat dinner that night. My appetite had been replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. I sat in the living room, trying to distract myself with TV, but the smell didn't fade. It lingered like a presence, filling the silence, daring me to investigate further. At 3 a.m., the sound began. Faint at first, just a soft clinking, like utensils tapping against porcelain. My breath caught as I realized it was coming from the kitchen. I stayed rooted to the couch, too terrified to move, but the noise grew louder. A scraping sound joined in, the unmistakable slide of a chair being pulled out from the table. Gathering every ounce of courage, I crept toward the kitchen, my footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. As I approached, the sound stopped abruptly. The kitchen was empty. The plate and silverware were still on the table, untouched, but the air felt colder, heavier, as if someone had just left. The next morning, I couldn't focus at work. My mind kept returning to the sound of the chair, the precise placement of the plate. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but a gnawing suspicion had taken root. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. Something was happening in my apartment, and I had no idea how to stop it. That evening, I decided to test a theory. I set up my phone on the counter, pointing it toward the table, and left it recording. I turned off all the lights, locked my bedroom door, and climbed into bed. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually exhaustion overtook me. When I woke, it was still dark outside. The smell was stronger than ever, so thick I could almost taste it. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and stopped the recording, dread pooling in my stomach as I opened the video. At first, there was nothing. The table sat in silence, the dim light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows on the walls. But then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., movement. The silverware shifted ever so slightly, as if an invisible hand had nudged it. A moment later, the chair slid back on its own, the legs scraping against the floor. The sound sent shivers down my spine. Then the plate moved. It didn't topple or skid. It lifted, hovering a few inches above the table before gently settling back down. The video ended there, but I couldn't bring myself to watch it again. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. The next night, the smell started earlier. I was still awake, pacing the living room when it hit me like a wave. This time, there was no subtlety. It wasn't just one dish, it was a banquet. Rich spices, seared meat, buttery sauces. It was intoxicating, overwhelming. My stomach growled despite my fear. And then I saw it. The table was no longer empty. Plates, bowls, and glasses materialized before my eyes, laden with food that looked too perfect to be real. Steam rose from the dishes, curling in the air like tendrils of smoke. The knife I had hidden in the drawer was now resting beside the largest plate, glinting under the dim light. The room felt alive, buzzing with an energy that made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, compelled by something I couldn't explain, but a low whisper stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, almost indistinct, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped, then a single word echoed in the silence, low and guttural, as if spoken from the depths of the walls. "Eat." I backed away, my heart pounding, but the air pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. The smell grew sharper, almost acrid, as if the feast were starting to decay before my eyes. And then I saw the shadow, a tall, distorted figure standing just beyond the kitchen, its outline rippling like heat waves. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching me. I ran to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. The whispers followed, faint and mocking. I didn't sleep that night, and when the sun finally rose, the table was empty again. The knife, the plates, the food, everything was gone. But the shadow remained, burned into my mind. The next morning, I did what I should have done weeks ago. I started researching the building. I spent the entire morning researching, my hands trembling as I typed. I started with the history of the building, an old Art Deco masterpiece that had seen better days. It had been built in the 1920s and housed some of the city's most exclusive tenants during its prime. But what caught my attention was a name I hadn't heard before: Victor Duval. Victor had been a celebrated chef in the 1930s, known for his extravagant, private dining experiences. Articles praised his culinary genius, describing his meals as ethereal and otherworldly. But alongside the glowing reviews, I found darker rumors. Victor had disappeared suddenly, right after a series of gruesome crimes in the city. Victims had gone missing without a trace, and whispers began to circulate that Victor's dinners had a far more sinister ingredient. The final nail came when I stumbled upon an archived newspaper clipping. It featured a grainy black and white photo of Victor standing in what was unmistakably my apartment's kitchen. His face was sharp, almost skeletal, his eyes hollow yet intense. Behind him, the counter was lined with plates, the food blurred into unrecognizable shapes. The headline read, "Chef Duval's Final Feast, the Banquet of Shadows." That night, I resolved to end this. I couldn't keep living in fear, with the smell invading every corner of my life and the shadow lingering at the edges of my vision. Whatever was happening, it was tied to Victor, and I needed to confront it. I stayed awake, sitting at the dining table, the room dark except for the faint glow of the street lamp outside. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the smell returned, richer and heavier than ever. My stomach churned, a sick mix of hunger and nausea. Then, just like before, the plates appeared. One by one, they materialized out of the darkness, steaming and gleaming, their contents both beautiful and grotesque. The knife I had hidden was back, resting beside the largest plate. The whispers began again, soft and insistent. This time, I didn't run. I stayed seated, gripping the edge of the table as the room grew colder. "Victor," I said aloud, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then the shadow emerged, stepping into the faint light. It was taller now, its form more distinct. I could see the outline of a face, sharp and angular, and the faint glint of something metallic in its hand. "You brought them back," a voice rasped, low and guttural, as though coming from the walls themselves. "They're hungry." I realized with horror what he meant. The food wasn't for me. It was for them, the shadowy figures I had sensed but never seen. And now, I was part of the meal. "No," I whispered, standing so abruptly that the chair screeched against the floor. "I didn't bring anything back." The shadow moved closer, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing against my chest. "You stayed," it said. "You let them in." The smell grew rancid, the once delicious aromas twisting into something foul and decayed. The food on the table began to rot before my eyes, the plates cracking and oozing with something dark and viscous. The whispers returned, louder and angrier, filling the room like a storm. I grabbed the knife from the table, my hands slick with sweat. "You can't have me," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. "This ends now." The shadow lunged, and for a moment, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious, minutes, hours? When I opened my eyes, the table was gone. The plates, the food, the shadow, everything had disappeared. The air was clear, the smell gone. It felt like waking from a nightmare, except for one thing. On the counter, where the knife had been, there was a single plate, empty, except for a smear of something red. Beside it was a folded napkin embroidered with a name, Victor Duval. I packed my belongings that same morning, leaving everything that didn't fit in my car. As I drove away from the building, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The windows of my apartment were dark, but for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, a tall, angular figure, watching me leave. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faintest hint of a smell, roasted meat, garlic, and spices. It's always just enough to make my stomach twist, to remind me that Victor Duval might still be out there, waiting for his next feast.